Elizabeth Drew has a new book. This is what, number 11? Mm-hmm. And here's what the cover looks like, The Corruption of American Politics. I want to ask you about some things in here that haven't gotten a lot of attention. I'm going to turn to page 70, and you write all about this thing called chairs at universities that are endowed by American corporations, maybe some unions. Why did you put this in the book?
Well, the whole book is an attempt to examine how our politics have changed in the last 25 years and how Washington has changed and how its methods of dealing have changed. And this was just one aspect of what I call the money culture, how this town is suffused by, not just on Capitol Hill, but downtown among the lobbyists, the lawyers, the contractors, and what people do and sometimes how inventive they have become in buying access, which is really basically what it's about. And I first heard some defense contractors complaining about this, that the arm was constantly being put on them to endow a chair, usually for a retiring senator. In one case, Trent Lott, he's not retiring, but there's a chair that's being endowed for him.
At the University of Mississippi?
Yes, Ole Miss. And there was one really funny story about Senator Inouye, who decided that he wanted one of the ships that had been partly destroyed at Pearl Harbor sent back from, I think it's in northwest Washington, out west, to Hawaii. And one of the things that I think gets lost in the coverage of money is people don't talk to what I call the hit-up-ees. And here I had contractors. This man said, oh man, it's the bane of our existence, because they call up and say, you know, can you come to this dinner and give a certain amount? And the lobbyists get hit up all the time, and through them, their clients. And the reason they go along with it is because they have what they call quality time. I mean, as you know, Brian, the laws have changed, the rules have changed, and a lobbyist can no longer take out a senator or representative for a good dinner. They're not allowed to spend that much on them. So this way, they go to these dinners and they have what they call quality time.
Elizabeth Drew, her new book will be here for the next 40 minutes. You can begin dialing now. We ask for first-time callers only, so we can hear some new voices out there. I want to read you what this defense contractor lobbyist said to you in an anonymous quote. Now we're finding that not only do we support some members throughout their entire public life as long as they're helpful to us, but the year they retire, there's a flurry of activity. It's now typical that when a member retires, the member thinks it's wonderful to have a chair endowed in his name at a university in his state. It's a big money deal, and we're usually very easy. Senior members who retire almost always get a university chair. It amounts to buying a table for a dinner for $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, or they may ask for $100,000 or even $1 million. There's no limit. This is a charitable contribution to a university to endow a chair. Therefore, it's tax deductible. You talk about Sam Nunn, Jesse Helms, Al Gore in the name of his sister. Explain that one.
Well, he started a chair in the name of his sister who died of lung cancer. And that ran into a little bit of trouble because the person raising the money for the chair was also his political fundraiser, Peter Knight. So they took Peter Knight off the job. But it's just one of several examples. In this case, an indirect one to benefit somebody who is still in politics. But as I say, this is just one of the many ways people try to achieve what some of them try to achieve all the time, which is purchasing access to the people up there on Capitol Hill so that they can put the arm on them about something.
We want you to give us a call right now, and we're going to get the phones going here for Elizabeth Drew. Thoroughfare, New Jersey. The subject is money this morning and its influence on the political process. Thoroughfare, New Jersey. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Drew. I admire your writings quite a bit and watch you on your occasional television appearances. I wonder if you might be able to shed some light on the issues with Johnny Chung and all of the money that seems to have poured into the Clinton campaign, and why they don't seem to be able to get to the bottom of some of the what would appear to be rather small issues to find out, like who fired the or who hired the IRS and FBI to audit the travel office people and the 1,000 FBI files, and who hired Craig Livingston. I don't see all these crack reporters don't seem to be able to get to the bottom of that. Maybe you have the answers.
Well, you're right. Some of these stories have sort of ended up in abeyance. I think everybody has investigated as far as they can on, to take one of your examples, how did this Craig Livingston, who was simply a political operative, first of all, how did he become in charge of the Office of Personnel Security in the White House, which is a pretty sensitive job? What were those 500 or so Republican names doing in their own files? Well, it's been investigated. Some things frustratingly come to a dead end. On the question of Johnny Chung, actually the Justice Department investigation is proceeding, and they've been able to turn some witnesses, including Chung. And the question is, where does his money go back to? I think we have learned some things about that. And Charlie Tree has now agreed to talk. They'll probably say as little as they can, but still try to fulfill the deals they make. So I think we have some more news coming out about that investigation.
Elizabeth Drew in her book quotes former Democratic Congressman, and this is over a lunch in 1977, two things have changed so dramatically in the last dozen years: the severity of this town and the money chase. It goes together. All the races are about ethics. The other guy's ethics, they aren't like that. They weren't like that before. Going through people's financial records, campaigns changed from the mid-'80s on. The harsher, the better. We go next to Hamden, Connecticut for Elizabeth Drew. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling because I've followed you for years, Mr. Drew, and although we don't agree politically, I do respect your opinions. And I've got to get your book. I haven't read it yet. The thing that bothers me is everybody puts down the old smoke-filled rooms, but you look at the class of leaders that we got back in those days, anywhere from Roosevelt and Truman, to what we get these days out of this so-called primary system, where voter turnout is dropping like it's subject to the law of gravity. I think we're better off going back to the powers that be in those back rooms. People forget that they chose candidates because they knew what the voters wanted.
Thanks.
Well, I think you have an awfully good point, and on this we do agree, both in presidential politics and in the politics on Capitol Hill. I'm not waxing nostalgic for everything that came before. In some ways it was too cozy, it was much less open. Women and minorities really weren't didn't have many opportunities in politics the way they do now. But we had a bunch of very talented legislators, some of them quite eccentric, but very good legislators. And one of the main points in my book, based on lots of conversations, people in both parties, is basically the quality of the politicians has declined. They used to have some ideas, have weathered some storms, have an argument for them for their own candidacy, and now, as one of the political consultants said to me, if they can raise the money and get the pollster, they can become a member of Congress without having really done anything in life, and they no sooner get to the House than this careerism, which I suppose is in other parts of society as well, takes over. And whether or not they've done anything in the House, in what different sense? And he has a good question, and remind me of it if I forget. But in there, I was talking to various lobbyists who admitted that sometimes they create grassroots support. Nearly half of them having come from the House. And I was a middle-aged senator who said to me, we have too many House members around here. This adds to the inclination to think short, to think to the next election, to think scrappy, to think how to make the political point, and not deal and not debate the great issues of our time. Someone said, a Senate aide said to me, we just go from skirmish to skirmish until we get to the next election. And one other point about this that I think people don't know very much about, we hear about the political consultants advising the president, the presidential campaigns. Well, they've now moved into Capitol Hill as well. And many of the battles that you will see are, as somebody used the word up there, fomented by the consultants because they think it'd be good for their client or their party to promote this issue before the next election.
Elizabeth Drew quotes another former Democratic member of Congress as saying, what's so often misunderstood about the way we finance our campaigns is it doesn't affect big decisions, such as how to fix Social Security. It's the smaller things which don't get reported on spending bills, on tax bills, on authorization bills. Kensington, Connecticut for Ms. Drew. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
You're on the air.
Oh, this is great. It's been years that I've been watching you, but I also watched Elizabeth Drew around 25 years ago when she was on regularly with my husband, so it's nice to see you also. My question is about teachers' unions. I am a teacher. I know we're often criticized for supporting certain candidates, and I was wondering if you have any viewpoints on that. Do you think we're corrupting the system also?
First of all, who's your husband?
Our donations.
Caller, you alluded to watching Ms. Drew. Was her husband on with her?
No.
Or were you just watching it with your husband?
I see.
Together and watch. I don't even remember the name of the show right now.
All right, thanks. What show was it that you appeared regularly?
Inside Washington, I suppose. No, I don't have any problem with what the teachers' unions are doing. I don't have any problems with the interest groups with true interest before the legislative branch, organizing themselves and trying to influence the outcome. The problem comes when that's all that's going on and becomes a kind of gridlock. And on some issues, like the Great Telecommunications Act of 1995, it was more really that the interest groups sat at the table and carved it up to each to their own advantage, and the people who lost out were the consumers and the citizens. And I also think, and maybe, Brian, we can get into this, people are now so discouraged about our politics, which is one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. But people can have much more impact than they think on
competitive carrier in the cellular business. That works in favor of nobody doing anything because members don't want to work against our friends, or you get a hodgepodge butchered legislation. The 1995 Act was butchered legislation. We go to Merrimack, Massachusetts for Elizabeth Drew. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN, and thanks for your program. I haven't read your book, Ms. Drew. I look forward to getting it quickly and reading it, because I think that our democratic system's in trouble, as indicated by your own title, and we need some political reforms, especially in the area of campaign finance reform. But I think the campaign finance bills have been on the wrong track, because it's amazing to me, and I hope this is not true of your book, the overwhelming emphasis is on money, 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 whereas, you know, that the other element of people's time as volunteers in the political process, and that's where the grassroots I see drying up. And I'm wondering what your book may say on this issue of people's contributions of time and how the grassroots can be watered, how the grassroots contributions of people's time can be revived through their participation in the process.
Let me ask you first, what is a grass top?
Oh, well, the caller's using grassroots in a somewhat different sense, and he has a good question, and remind me of it if I forget. But in there, I was talking to various lobbyists who admitted that sometimes they create grassroots support for some issue, or they stir it up back in the member's district or the senator's state, which again shows that they know that these people are much more subject to public opinion. But what you picked up is that one of the lobbyists said, well, as soon as one technique gets widely used, we invent another one. And so lately they've had something called grass tops, where they go strictly for the real opinion makers, the mayor or whatever, the really important people in the district, sometimes paying them, apparently.
What's AstroTurf?
Well, it's another form of the grassroots, grass tops, AstroTurf.
Not real, then. It's not a real grassroots. And this man's talking about what happens to the grassroots and all that.
Well, he's talking about something very important, I think slightly different, which is the role of the grassroots actually in elections and the grassroots groups. In some ways, it has increased. And the 1996 election actually was much more about who was going to control the House than it was about the presidency. And the grassroots groups, by this I mean real groups, the Christian Coalition or the World Wildlife Sierra Club, whatever, both sides, and labor, of course, geared up like mad to give their time to get people to the polls. And I covered that, and I remember at the end of that, Ralph Reed, who was then head of the Christian Coalition, said to me, "We fought each other to a draw." There's a kind of myth in the Republican Party that the Democrats have this huge advantage in the labor, what they call in-kind contribution. But it looks to me, and it certainly was the case in '96 and also '98, that those kind of in-kind contributions, the volunteer work, works on both sides, and that in the end, the analyses suggest that business outspent labor in the last couple elections from 7-1 to 11-1.
Tommy Boggs, a big lobbyist in this town, is quoted in this book by Elizabeth Drew as saying the best time for a member to hold a fundraiser is right after a recess because nobody has seen anybody. September is a big month. It's like going back to school. Boggs' firm itself holds a host of fundraisers. Another lobbyist says they must have events every single day. I get a half dozen invitations a month from them. Boggs laughed and said he's probably right. Louisville, Kentucky for Elizabeth Drew. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Hi.
One of the things that keeps coming to my mind is that most of the campaign financing laws that we put in place have to do with how much people can give. But most people in this country have never tried to raise large sums of money. And one of the things I do sometimes is, as a consultant, is help people, nonprofit organizations, raise money. And raising a great amounts of money can't be done effectively with lots of small donors. And instead of looking at who can give what, my own feeling is that it might be more effective to look at controlling the costs of elections instead of controlling the givers.
Thanks.
Well, there have been several attempts to do that. The people who want reform think that it would not pass constitutional muster to just flatly say, you can only spend so much, but that they could model something on the presidential system, which is on shaky grounds right now, which says if you will volunteer to only spend X, we will give you federal funds. And so that's one way of doing it. But, you know, the major campaign finance reform legislation that has been up before the House and Senate, and I may say passed by both chambers, but blocked by parliamentary tricks by opponents. Senator McCain tried to put in that bill just exactly what you're talking about, that in exchange for voluntary limits, the government would give them some subsidies, lower cost air time, just in order to keep this thing within bounds, and also to keep the politicians from having to spend an inordinate amount of their time for raising money. But they couldn't even get this to the floor of the Senate, and one of the big players in this were the broadcasters, who don't want any further reduction of their revenue from these elections.
We'll have Alan Hantman here in about 25 minutes. He's the architect of the Capitol. Talk about the dome right behind us. You can see the scaffolding right up there. That's a live picture. We go next to Wayne, New Jersey for Elizabeth Drew. Good morning.
Good morning. I want to first thank you for the President's Series.
Oh, thanks.
I think it's the best television on right now, no doubt about it. You know, the funny thing was I used to believe, as your guest is speaking, about the need to limit campaign reform, campaign spending. However, that and my politics have shifted very dramatically to the middle, because I find that after Ed Morrow made the impact on the news that he did, news reporters no longer were objective. They became advocates for causes. And when you confront them on the issue, they smile sweetly at you and say, well, everyone has biases. Everyone may have biases, but they have no business being in the news story. And it is most important that the news be objective and for them to keep their biases out. And I do not for 1 minute believe that they make any serious effort to do that.
All right, sir, thanks. We'll let that comment stand and go on to another caller about this book. We go to Battle Creek, Michigan for Elizabeth Drew. Good morning.
Hi.
Hi.
Brad, I don't know if this fits in, but I was sitting at a computer at a Fortune 500 chemical company, International, and during a power surge, I got bumped into an area that said, you're now in top security, you know, area available only to top security, CIA, and college regents. I don't even know what a regent is. When you were talking about endowing a chair, do those two things go together?
Thanks.
No, not necessarily. What the a regent is like a board of governors of a university. It has more to do with the member who's about to retire. In the case of Strom Thurmond, not of retiring, but of giving up the chairmanship of the Armed Services Committee. And they just think it'd be swell to have a chair endowed in their honor. And in some cases, you know, then when they do retire, they have a place where they can park, do some teaching and so on, and run their business from there.
Schuylkill Haven, Pennsylvania, for Elizabeth Drew, a native of Cincinnati. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Hi.
I would like to ask Ms. Drew if she didn't think it would be a good idea to pass legislation on campaign financing, which would state that if you can't vote for an individual, you shouldn't be able to contribute.
Elizabeth Drew?
Well, that's an interesting concept. I'm very seized of the idea that if this low turnout, in 1996 it was the lowest since 1924, I believe. In 1998 it was lower. It was the lowest since 1942. And what concerns me is the number of people who say it's just all awful there, it doesn't count, I'm not going to vote. I sometimes think, well, these people have given up their franchise. The voting does matter. Sometimes candidates squeak by. And of course then there are the primaries where turnout is abysmal. And then later on people complain, how did we get this set of candidates? Well, because they didn't bother to get out and vote. This idea that Washington isn't relevant to people's lives, so don't bother, really is not on the mark at all. Every day, decisions are being made up there that affect people's daily lives. Who pays what taxes, the state of their healthcare system, the safety of the food they eat, the air they breathe, the water they drink, the safety of the airplanes they ride on, the soundness of the banking system. I could go on and on. And people might feel, you know, they don't much like Washington, or they don't like the kinds of decisions that come out. But if they don't vote, they've checked out.
Here's what the book looks like, The Corruption of American Politics by Elizabeth Drew. And this is put out by Birch Lane Press, the division of Carroll Publishing. Salderness, New York, you're next. What would you like to say?
Hello. I would like to know what happens to the campaign money if the person doesn't want to run.
Thanks.
Campaign money that goes to someone who doesn't run?
Somebody say, and also if it's left over from the last campaign, what can they do with it?
Well, I think there are now greater restrictions on pocketing it and saying that was nice and walking away and building a weekend home with it. The campaign money in the parties goes, if there is any left. Most parties end up in debt. A lot of campaigns end up in debt. And you're a lot better off if you won than if you lost, because if you won, one of the first things people want to do is ingratiate themselves with you because you did get back, and it's a lot easier to raise the money. I think, though, Brian, I mean, one of the real collapses in the whole campaign finance system, and one of the most serious ones that we've seen, is, and this gets to an earlier question, the presidential system, which did work for 2 or 3 presidential elections. You hear people say these laws never worked, but they did. Now what happens is, if you're a presidential candidate, if you're the nominee, you agree to accept X million from the federal government, you sign a document and agree not to raise any more money for your campaign. And what we saw in '96 was not without precedent, but it was in its magnitude, certainly without precedent, is the candidates, and particularly Mr. Clinton and Mr. Gore, going out and raising tons and tons of money of what's called soft money, money that otherwise isn't legal in campaigns. It's a loophole that was written into the law but a very helpful Federal Election Commission. So in effect, that whole system has been destroyed because the money that they raised, ostensibly for the political parties, was going right back into their campaigns. And a number of people on the Hill feel that they've got to do something about this at some point. If nothing else, say, hey, this wasn't what was intended by the presidential system.
Just a couple of stories that kind of dovetail with what you're writing about on the front page of the New York Times. Adam Clymer, from high to low, hopefuls for 2000 are awash in funds. He writes, at all levels, the political system is awash in money. George W. Bush of Texas may have the most startling bankroll, $36.3 million, but he is part of a phenomenon, not the phenomenon itself. Here's the headline in today's roll call. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee reports 6-month record. House Democrats have more cash than Republicans. On the other side, would-be chairman hit money trail. On and on we go to Jefferson City, Missouri for Elizabeth Drew.
Yes, Ms. Drew, thank you. Isn't this the perfect time for campaign finance reform, tying it into the billions of dollars of digital bandwidth that's being given to the media right now?
Given to the media? I don't know how you do that, but yes, it's time for campaign reform. It was time some time ago, and you'll hear a lot of Washington commentators saying, oh, the public isn't interested, this sort of easy cynicism. But there have been several instances where the public has been tested on this subject of cleaning up the campaign finance system, and they come out in favor of it. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, a reform bill that was not terribly stringent but would have been a couple of steps in the right direction did have majorities in the House and the Senate last year. But the Republican leaders in both chambers who didn't want this legislation engaged in legislative tricks and stalling in order to prevent it being passed, even though it had majorities. I think we're about to see a rerun of that in July, where Senator McCain, who's one of the most ardent supporters of reform, is going to try to bring that legislation up, and he will have a big battle on his hands. But he will be talking about it, and I think each time this issue is aired and some of the new ramifications of it are discussed, it moves further and further toward having the kind of support that eventually Congress will not be able to ignore.
One more from roll call. Oxley Tozan locked in major fundraising battle. 3 potential chairmen, Representatives Bill Thomas, Billy Tozan, and Michael Oxley, have already raised a combined $1.5 million for the GOP this year, and several others have created leadership PACs to signal their intended generosity. The wannabe chairman insists their generosity is not a down payment on a future chairmanship, rather proof of their commitment to protecting the GOP's fragile 6-vote majority. Seniority, track records, and personal relationships are far more important variables, they say. But several senior GOP lawmakers are raising record amounts of it in anticipation of a contested campaign for chairmanships in 2000. Catawba, South Carolina, for Elizabeth Drew. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I have a question and maybe a suggestion about how we might be able to track some of this money. Is like you were talking about the foundations and the endowments supporting different candidates or ideas or...
Oh, foundations can't.
Foundations can't?
Cannot, no.
Well, my specific question, and I tried calling in when the topic was hot, was about Paula Jones. John Whitehead is an officer and a trustee of the $6 billion J. Paul Getty Foundation. And also the Florence Schumann. He's on the Schumann Foundation board. I'm wondering if this is the same John Whitehead that helped back Paula Jones and acted in her legal assistance.
Well, there are a couple of John Whiteheads. I know one of them who's not the man that was involved in the Paula Jones case.
A Democrat.
Yes, and he may be the one engaged in the Schumann Foundation. In any event, it is slightly afield. Actually, foundations, because they are tax-exempt, contributions are tax-exempt, are not supposed to be in the legislative process, but I guess it's okay for them to be, some of them, in the judicial process, or at least that's the edge that they're pushing.
Elizabeth Drew quotes Don Goldberg, a White House aide who helped prepare for the Thompson hearings, as saying, on the Hill, if you don't have much to go on, you decry the partisanship, and the print reporters will write in the first or second paragraph, and the TV stories will begin, quote, in a hearing mired in partisanship, and then they get to the subject of the hearing, and you've won. That's Damage Control 101. Who is Don Goldberg? What role did he play in the Thompson hearings? And did John Glenn set out to be as partisan as he ended up?
Remind me of all those. Don Goldberg was a White House aide in the legislative branch office of the White House. And I was terribly pleased that he was ready to say on the record what I'd not seen laid out anywhere, that this became a tool of the Clinton White House in particular, that if there were what they considered adversarial hearings, and there were some adversarial hearings, no question about it, their strategy, Damage Limitation 101, was to describe and attack these hearings as partisan. I covered the Thompson hearings, and it was hard to get down the hall without someone from the White House or the Democratic National Committee or a staff member of the Democrats saying, isn't it awful how partisan these hearings are? And the strategy was as obvious as it was successful. And so the White House did get a lot of stories like that, mired again in partisan politics, the Thompson Committee, and by this time people were paying less attention to the subject. As for John Glenn, no. Well, the whole Fred Thompson story is a terribly interesting one. There's not time here, but here's a man who really tried to investigate the state of our campaign finance system and where the money was coming from and was it broken down. But very shortly after Trent Lott proudly named him, the Republican leaders turned on him because Thompson was committing the ultimate sin of saying that these hearings should lead to campaign finance reform, which most of the Senate Republicans, especially the leadership, opposed. And he wanted to broaden the hearings to cover what might have been Republican misactions in 1996, as well as the more obvious Democratic ones. Similarly, the White House staff, working with the staff of the Democrats on the Hill, or directly with the senators, were shooting at him and going on about how partisan it was. At the same time, the intelligence agencies, with whom he was trying to get the information, were sort of playing a double game on him about what he had found, and they held out material, or they appeared to hold out material until the hearings were over. And at the same time, the interest groups who might have been investigated for their coordination, which might not have been legal, with campaigns, and they all got together. You had meetings around town in law offices of the ACLU and the National Right to Life Committee, the Christian Coalition, AFL-CIO, and on it went. And they banded together and said, we're not going to answer the committee's subpoenas. Now, this is a first and a fairly dangerous precedent, that these groups can get together and say, too bad, we don't care, we're just not going to do it. It was because of all these things that Thompson finally concluded they'd shut down his hearings. Most people think they fizzled out and went away, but it was a much richer and more interesting story. Another wisdom, though, about the Thompson hearings is that they didn't accomplish very much. I think they did, and I think they helped push campaign finance reform forward and sort of forced Trent Lott to bring it up on the Senate floor.
Canton, New York, for Elizabeth Drew. Good morning.
Ms. Drew, it's awfully nice to see you on television again. I enjoyed you in the past. I hope to read your book soon. I'm a retired broadcaster, and I've got a couple of comments to make. First of all, what percentage of, say, a senatorial candidate's budget goes to radio and TV?
Oh, I wish I could give the answer. Out of their campaign funds, it depends on the kind of state they're in, how many media outlets there are, how expensive the media outlets are. Like in New York and California, they're very, very expensive. So it's probably the biggest part of their campaign money goes to these ads.
Canton?
All right. The second question I have is, or the second comment I have, will you tell us about the fact that the Federal Communications Act of 1923, whenever it was, that all radio and television stations in this country are licensed by the FCC to perform a public service. They're not licensed to make money.
Thanks, caller. The act was 1934.
Yeah, well, you're on to a very, very important point. This is I think it's the only industrialized country that gives away the broadcast spectrum free. But the broadcasters are a very, very forceful group, and the members of Congress are leery of crossing them. And that is why, as I said earlier, something that would have limited the cost of campaigns and forced them to have more subsidized commercials just didn't even make it to the Senate floor.
Back to the book and more on the Thompson hearings. Ms. Drew writes, the White House called on Mark Mellman for help in getting Glenn to be more partisan. Mellman, a stocky man with a short black beard and thick dark hair, played an almost unnoticed role in shaping the Democrats' strategy. The White House aide said Mellman was responsible for the Democrats' overall message, partisanship as opposed to defending the White House. We go next to Baltimore. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I find your guest tremendously interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading her book. What I would like to know is, could we have, say, with the impossible case of passing campaign reform, could we have some sunshine? Is it possible that we could get the newspapers to list both the contributions and the sources of the contributions?
Thanks.
Well, they do. They are listed at the Federal Election Commission, and at some point they're open to anybody who wants to go see them, and the press can certainly go in and do it.
Is it on the internet?
Well, no, but there is, well, eventually it's on the internet, but one of the proposals on the Hill is instant access on the internet. But that is often proposed, quite frankly, by people who oppose any real reform. And I know of newspapers who heroically go down to the FEC and try to patch up the names with where they work and figure out, and it takes a very long time. So while I think there could be a little more sunshine, I don't think it'll make a fundamental difference.
Bellevue, Florida, for Elizabeth Drew. Go ahead, please.
Brian, Ms. Drew, I just watched on the news this morning a report about the HMO health plan legislation that they're considering right now, and it occurred to me they run part of an ad that obviously was paid for by some pretty wealthy special interest group, and they just portray that as being the people are portrayed as being everyday citizens making comments about how they don't want their premiums raised and so on. It seems to me that there ought to be a disclaimer on these things to show who the sponsor for those things are.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I want to leave you all, if only with one thing. The fact that the Senate is now debating HMO reform, and it's now highly partisan, because both sides see it as a very strong political issue going into the next election. But the fact that they're debating it at all shows that they really are responsive to public pressure. I've heard members, I think most people think, oh, I can't possibly affect these people, the interests have run the thing. But I've heard senators say, oh, I came back from my town meeting and 10 people there said such and such. Or Joe told me about what happened at his town meeting this weekend. And I would say to concerned or upset citizens, go to the town meetings. Tell them what you think. I was on a panel with a senator last year, and he said, if we get 300 calls on an issue, that's a lot of calls. That's not the organized calls that they can reckon. Well, 300 calls from an entire state is not a lot of calls. So these polls here really are more responsive to what their constituents say than I think some of the portrayals of how Washington works would suggest.
Last call for Elizabeth Drew. We go to Georgia. Go ahead, please.
Ms. Drew, I'm concerned about the way everyone uses the word reform. It's meaningless. Campaign finance reform is something that I think every politician wants, everybody in the country wants. McConnell wants reform. Reform means change. He wants immediate disclosure and no rules. And I go along with that. That's reform. But when people say somebody's against reform, it's just not true.
Thanks.
Well, that gets into the linguistics. You're absolutely right that a lot of people who actually do oppose real reform will say, oh, I'm for reform, I'm for this or for that, but they aren't really for reform. And I think one of the great sources of public cynicism now is just this kind of thing, people being hypocritical about whether they're really for reform or not. I mean, I would put in my indictment the president, who once in a while, especially when the issue gets hot, he trots out and says, I am really for reforming. By this, he means changing to accomplish certain things, the campaign finance laws, and then he goes away again. So you're right, the word is kind of meaningless. You have to know, well, really what these people mean by it when they say reform, and you have to watch to see what they do, or if they just mouth this but don't really try to do anything about it.
We're going up to New York in about a half an hour for our U.S. grant program. Speaking of corruption, there's about 8 years in which the cabinet got in a lot of trouble. We'll find out from John Y. Simon and others on how that worked. Last quote from your book, Elizabeth Drew. There isn't anything, this is Steve Stockmeyer, a Republican who's been active in politics for a lot of years and a lobbyist. There isn't anything in this whole business that couldn't be solved by individual politicians looking in the mirror. You say he told you one day, they don't have to raise year-round. They don't have to raise more than their opponents. They don't have to raise more money than they need or from people who have business before them. Nothing forces them to create the appearance problem.
Well, Steve Stockmeyer is a fascinating man, and he basically isn't for what we think of with reform. But he has a very important point there about the psychology that has fed this whole arms race for money. I loved it that he said that. I think the problem with it is that the one senator or 6 senators or congressmen who look in the mirror and say, I don't have to do this, aren't sure at all that their potential opponents are looking in the mirror and saying the same thing. So there are very few who are inclined to take unilateral action.
This is what the book looks like, The Corruption of American Politics, What Went Wrong and Why, by Elizabeth Drew. Thank you for coming this morning.
Thank you.